In the summer of 1914, the nations of Europe had entered upon a conflict of unforeseen and unprecedented savagery. The Drifter War had been as inexorable as it had been avoidable. Growing consensus and a seeming cordiality had masked the gathering storms of dissension and obscured the awesome logic of industrial mobilization and armament. From the Balkan storm center, the winds of war had blown outward, engulfing nation after nation. In a welter of rumors, threats, and frantic diplomacy, the great powers had mobilized, setting in train the inevitable logic of war. For 40 years, a pattern of alliances had maintained the balance of power in Europe and so the peace. By 1914, that pattern had crystallized into two great armed camps. In Central Europe, Germany and Austria-Hungary allied themselves with Turkey. On the periphery, Britain, France and Russia provided the counterweight. Since the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, military leaders, both progressive and reactionary, had all agreed on one thing: the primacy of attack as the best method of defense. Russian mobilization in support of her Balkan interests had fired a panic amongst the Central Powers. Fearing a war on two fronts, the Germans had long evolved a strategy for rapid mobilization and a lightning advance through Belgium into France. By outflanking the French army of any serious threat from the West. Thus it was that a system of alliances designed to maintain peace, combined with military philosophies placing the emphasis overwhelmingly on attack, pushed Europe ever closer and finally over the precipice into war. Everyone was pushed. Every nation went to war believing it did so in self-defense. And to the prospect of noble sacrifice, adventure and glory was added the assurance of moral virtue. Everywhere, there were demonstrations of national unity. Patriotism was inflamed by propaganda. Internal conflict dissipated in a new spirit of conciliation and compromise. There was a universal sense of righteousness and a belief that it would all be settled very quickly. In September, after 6 weeks of heavy fighting, the German drive through France and Belgium stalled on the Marne. In the east, the Russians were brought up with heavy losses at the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. By December, they'd gone over to the defensive, stabilizing the front line. In France, the war degenerated into a futile slaughter, made more terrible by unceasing bombardment, as both sides fought to regain the initiative and restore the wall of movement. Facing deadlock in France and an uneasy hiatus on the Eastern Front, the Allies secured the intervention of Italy by promises of territorial gains in Austria and the Balkans. But the contribution of the Italians proved inadequate to turn the flank of the Central Powers, or to break the military impasse by draining forces from other fronts. Further efforts were made to extend the war. Landings at Salonika and in the Dardanelles only brought fresh failures and more extensive deadlock on all fronts. Attempts were made to carry the war to the civil populations. On the high seas, the grand fleets of Britain and France enforced a blockade of their continental enemies. Under them, the Germans enforced their own. Mounting losses at the front were compounded by growing hardships at home. To increasing scarcity were added the shrill demands of industry. But if the flood of arms was intended to restore the war of movement, it did exactly the opposite. Over ground churned and blasted by incessant bombardment, advancing troops are at every disadvantage. Yet the carnage continued. At the battles at Verdun and the Somme in 1916, nearly 2 million lives were squandered in vain and ultimately futile attempts to break the impasse of arms. But the stalemate contained within it few hopes of peaceful resolution. The war that had begun as a battle for survival had developed its own unstoppable momentum. The emergence of Hindenburg and Ludendorff in Germany, Lloyd George in Britain, and Clemenceau in France marked a hardening of attitudes and a political impasse as entrenched as any deadlocked front. And so it was that 1917 found the powers still locked in conflict. A conflict made more deadly and more intractable by the impasse of arms and of initiative. On every field of battle, torpid struggles reflected the growing distress and utter exhaustion of men and nations. Only in the air was there any sense of vigor and of movement. The airplane at the outbreak of war was still in its infancy, and the first embryonic machines had been awkward and rudimentary contraptions, inviting disparagement rather than praise from the army command. Yet in the first few months of the war, they had proved their worth and amply rewarded the grudging investments that had been made in them. British airmen had been the first to report the German movements towards Mons and the Marne, enabling dispositions to be made to check them. The early pioneers of aerial reconnaissance had carried with them pistols or carbines. These, in turn, had been replaced by machine guns, mounted either at the rear of the aircraft or in such a position as to fire forward over the top of the propeller. (1915) had seen the development of the mechanical interrupter, a device that enabled the gun to fire through the arc of the propeller by disengaging the breech when the blade passed through the line of fire. This development inaugurated the first true fighter aircraft. Startling advances in aircraft technology during the war and the concomitant development of the tactics of aerial combat reflected a spirit of enterprise singularly lacking in almost every other theater of conflict. But by demonstrating their value in the field of reconnaissance, the first flyers had determined that hostilities would be carried with equal vehemence to the air. for control of the skies over the trenches determined control of military intelligence. As well as forward reconnaissance, aircraft were increasingly used for gun laying, enabling the artillery to more accurately target enemy positions. From primitive beginnings come the first specialist bombers, and the start of what was to prove to be an interminable controversy between tactical and strategic bombing. The Zeppelin raids on London had engendered the idea of the bombing not just of industries and facilities far from the front, but of whole populations, thereby undermining morale and damaging national resolve. The developing role of aircraft led to specialization and divergence, producing different designs for different purposes. By 1917, the world had seen the development of the first long-range bombers. Among their number, the remarkable Gotha, a twin-engine pusher aircraft that largely took over the role of the Zeppelin, bombing London intermittently from 1917 to the end of the war. It saw also the first pure fighter and the further refinement of fast light reconnaissance aircraft. Great strides were made in the development of specialist training, and both sides set about tackling the new problems of air defense. As well as barrage balloons, anti-aircraft guns were introduced. At first, Army field guns were fitted with high-angle mountings, but these were soon joined by specialist weapons firing time-fused shells. In the trenches, to the tired and increasingly burdened populations of the towns and cities, the exploits of these early airmen represented the only relief from the benumbing impasse at the front and the siren demands for ever greater sacrifice and effort at home. High above the languishing armies and the interminable mud, they fulfilled the illusory promise that had so galvanized the nations in the summer of 1914. The promise of adventure, noble combat, and heroic deeds. But for this, they would have to pay the butcher's bill. In 1 month on the Western Front in 1917, the British alone were to lose 316 pilots and observers, and 224 planes. At the time, almost a third of their entire operational strength. Of all the roles played by airmen in the Great War, one was to acquire a glamour and status above all others. He was the fighter pilot. The best would become known as aces. Among their ranks were names destined to live forever in the annals of warfare. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Major McMannock of the Royal Flying Corps. The Canadian fighter ace, Billy Bishop. And one who would use the mantle of fame to achieve infamy in another war. The German fighter ace, Hermann Göring. In 1917, flying and everything to do with flying gripped the imagination of the world. Developments in other fields were slower and were often subject to political intrigues. But one such innovation had already been tried and tested on the Somme in 1916. Though dismissed as an absurdity when it first appeared, The tank in 1917 was fast becoming recognized as a very formidable weapon of war. The only weapon, moreover, that appeared capable of restoring initiative and movement to the front. In Britain and France, different designs were being developed and tested with a heightened sense of urgency and anticipation. And tactical doctrine, for long written in tablets of stone, was at last being reconsidered in the light of the reality of modern warfare. Yet, if such machines held out the prospect of breaking the deadlock at the front, they contributed no less to the increasing industrialization of the war. A conflict no less vital for its geographical remoteness from the battlefield. Recognition was growing that the war would ultimately be decided not by the weight of armies, but by the harnessing and application of the resources of industry to the production of the weapons of war. Numbers of soldiers were no longer seen as being as important as numbers of tanks, guns and aircraft. The first months of 1917 saw immense suffering amongst the home populations of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Poor harvests in 1915 and 16, combined with the Allied blockade, led to a bitter winter, where hunger and malnutrition contrasted darkly, as in other countries, with the conspicuous wealth of those who were profiting by the war. Increasing scarcity in every country led to the emergence of black markets, and with them widening inequalities, frustration and resentment. Industrialists too made enormous profits from the insatiable demand for arms. But everywhere the burden fell unerringly on the already poor and on the weak. In the first years of the war, the Germans had refrained from indiscriminate attacks on Allied shipping. But in the face of critical shortages and an ever-tightening blockade, the German leaders resolved upon an all-out U-boat offensive, their desperation evidenced by their implicit willingness to provoke American entry to the war. But nowhere were the burdens of war more heavily felt than in Russia. Industrialization had come late to Russia. Her peasantry had only been released from serfdom as recently as 1861, and the intervening years had seen immense social disruption. Rationalizations in agriculture and the emergence of independent farmers had accelerated the already considerable drift from the land, investing the cities with a vast, rootless and hungry proletariat. In such conditions were the immense resources of Russia realized. By the outbreak of war, she was industrializing faster than any other power, and war brought its own frantic stimulus. In the first 2 years of war, Russia passed through an industrial revolution quite unsurpassed in its scale or intensity. Her output of war equipment increased dramatically. But these achievements were not made without cost. Inflation rocketed, the transportation system began to break down. Food stocks accumulated in the countryside while the populations of the cities went hungry. Hardships at home were unrelieved by any prospect of victory at the front, or of any settlement, however distant. By 1917, the Russian economy was tottering on the brink. Her civilian population, as well as her army, was shell-shocked, demoralized, and bewildered. Mounting casualties, increasing deprivation, and the perceived impotence of the government all combined to fan the flames of revolt. Strikes and demonstrations swept St. Petersburg. In the last week of February, food rioters were joined by disaffected Cossacks stationed in the capital to maintain order. A Soviet, or Council, of Workers' and Soldiers' Representatives was proclaimed. Milling crowds seethed towards the Duma, a representative assembly instituted by the Tsar, but without any real power. Confronted by an embittered and potentially dangerous mob, and in the complete absence of any semblance of authority, the Duma reacted by proclaiming a provisional government. 3 days later, on March the 2nd, the Tsar signed the instrument of abdication, thereby recognizing both the provisional government and the revolution. On April the 6th, the United States declared war on Germany. The all-out U-boat offensive had made her intervention inevitable. The outbreak of war had rescued America from recession and sent her economy booming through 1915 and 1916, servicing the needs of the warring nations. The startling early successes of the U-boat campaign brought an abrupt halt to this expansion and threatened to pitch her economy into an even deeper slump. A further consideration was the security of her by now debt-ridden clients, principally Britain and France. The guarantee of their repayments ultimately depended on their victory. Yet, United States entry to the war was not based solely on such hard economic calculations. The U-boat war had offended the American sense of decency, and the revolution in Russia, by its promise of democracy, had enabled Americans to view the conflict as one between free peoples and the autocratic empires of the Central Powers. But American entry to the war brought little immediate respite to Britain, now suffering from chronic shortages and simmering discontent. In the first 5 months of the U-boat offensive, shipping losses reached critical proportions. In April alone, 1 ship out of every 4 that left port never returned. It seemed as if Britain might be facing the ultimate catastrophe, defeat through starvation, a fate she had planned to inflict on Germany. In May, the Royal Navy instituted a system of escorted convoys, simultaneously providing protection for the merchantmen and drawing the U-boats to battle. The convoy system effectively broke the back of the U-boat offensive. The development of hydrophonic listening devices and of depth charges contributing to turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic, and so ensure a further year of war on air, land, and sea. The spring brought only more carnage to the battlefields of France. A new French commander, General Nivelle, had promised full and final victory to the Allies in 1917. The Grand Offensive was launched on April the 16th in the region of Chemin des Dames. From the outset, the attack was a disaster. Despite minor British gains around Arras in the west, the main attack floundered against German positions largely unaffected by extensive bombardment. Nivelle persisted with his offensive for a further month. He had secured his promotion on the promise of victory, and anything less would be a personal disaster. In all, the Nivelle offensive was to cost the French army nearly 250,000 casualties, and damage its morale to such an extent that an epidemic of mutinies would threaten the complete military collapse of France. In May, the offensive finally petered out. Against the losses could be set no significant gains at all. To the French infantry, it seemed that their sacrifice had been entirely in vain. On May the 15th, Nivelle was dismissed. His replacement, General Pétain, faced the immense task of restoring both order and morale to his shattered armies. The French failure at Chemin des Dames placed the onus of initiative upon the British, their forces rebuilt and replenished since the disastrous losses of the Somme. To take the pressure off the French and to secure a purely British victory, General Haig determined on an attack in Flanders in the summer. The Third Battle of Ypres began with the most extensive artillery barrage of the war. The bombardment lasted for 2 weeks, achieving little, but rendering the landscape an almost impassable sea of mud, and surrendering every advantage to the defending Germans. The initial attack was pressed for 5 days, during which time 2 miles of mud were won at the cost of 32,000 casualties. Tanks drawn up behind the lines could play no part in the battle. There was no ground left capable of supporting their weight. On August the 6th, Haig resumed his offensive and persisted with repeated attacks through September and October. By November, Haig had advanced 6 miles, capturing the Passchendaele Ridge and all that remained of the village that would give the battle its name. The capture of Passchendaele was achieved at the cost of over 500,000 casualties, many of whom died by drowning. In Russia, the situation had deteriorated since the heady days of February. From the outset, there'd been intense competition between the Provisional Government, a creation of the Duma, and the Ad Hoc Soviet, a true child of the revolution. Straddling both these bodies towered the remarkable figure of Alexander Kerensky, a charismatic idealist determined to consolidate the fledgling Russian democracy. To do this, Kerensky believed he had to honor Russia's foreign commitments, and by continuing the war, achieve an honorable settlement for his country. But under Order Number 1 of the Soviet, the ordinary Russian soldier could no longer be compelled to follow orders that conflicted with his own personal wishes. Discipline at the front broke down completely. Desertion became endemic. Not the steady trickle of vagabond fugitives, but mass floods bordering on wholesale demobilization. Other, more insidious forces threatened Kerensky. The February events had come as a surprise to Russia's professional revolutionaries, an embarrassment they were keen to surmount. The Bolshevik leader Lenin had been in Switzerland, where the Germans had found him almost entirely ignorant of the crisis that was rocking his country. Seeing in Lenin the instrument with which they might not only topple Kerensky, but tumble the whole of Russia into catastrophe, they shipped him in secret through Germany into Russia, funneling money through their agents to finance his campaign of disruption. Lenin's first attempt to overthrow Kerensky ended in fiasco. Following an abortive putsch in July, Lenin was unmasked as a German agent and forced to flee St. Petersburg, disguising himself by shaving off his moustache and donning the clothes of a worker. In hiding in Finland, Lenin continued to plot against Kerensky, urging his supporters to seize key positions in the Soviet and so widen the gulf between Soviet and government. Conflicts between the government and what remained of the army, combined with increasing economic and industrial chaos, further weakened Kerensky and strengthened the Bolsheviks, now frantically arming in anticipation of a general collapse of the government. On the morning of October the 27th, while Kerensky was out of the capital trying to muster support in the countryside, the Winter Palace was looted by Bolsheviks, proclaiming the fall of the provisional government. In such circumstances was democracy finally extinguished in Russia. The victory of the Bolsheviks brought an end to Russia's participation in the war, a participation that had of recent been more nominal than actual. The Peace of Brest-Litovsk, signed early in 1918, allowed Germany to transfer divisions and amass her forces for one last great offensive in the West. The contest for air supremacy had been one of technology as much as tactics. The startling developments of the early years of the war had become the subtle refinements of the latter. A small improvement in structure or in engine power, adding a few miles an hour to an aircraft's speed, or a keener edge to its performance, could enable it to instantly outclass an opponent's machine, turning it into a virtual death trap. The Sopwith-Camel in 1917 had assured the ascendancy of the British. But the arrival of the superlative Fokker Mark 7 in 1918 restored supremacy in the air to the Germans. With the skies over the trenches once again under their command, the Germans were able to assemble in secret an army of 3 million men and 10,000 guns. Ludendorff's plan was to unleash a lightning offensive along a 40-mile section of the front. The aim was to smash the British armies on the Somme, unhinging the Allied front and rolling up the line from east to west. The attack opened at dawn on March the 21st, 1918. After a short but shattering bombardment, the Germans advanced under cover of a thick cloud of morning mist. This time, they were not an array of massed infantry. Instead, specially trained shock troops probed for weaknesses in the British lines. After them came combat teams to open up the breaches for the following waves. These were entirely new tactics, the tactics of lightning advance and rapid encirclement. They would later become known as the tactics of Blitzkrieg. In 1918, they were devastating. By nightfall, the Germans had advanced deep into the rear of the British battle zone, and within days were driving through open country. Thousands of British troops had simply been left behind by the battle. It seemed to many that the war might be drawing to an end. The British positions on the Somme had been smashed apart, their armies in danger of extinction. The French were preparing to pull back on Paris. But at the last moment, disaster was averted, not by any miracle of arms, but by placing the British Army under the command of Marshal Foch, thereby unifying command and committing the French to shoring up the British. In early April, the lightning advance of the Germans began to flag. Although driven into near rout, the British and French were falling back on their own hastily mobilized reserves. The Germans, by contrast, were outrunning theirs. For 4 days, the Germans halted their offensive to re-equip and resupply. Both sides knew that the war was now moving to its supreme crisis. American troops were at last arriving in numbers sufficient to tip the balance. If the Allies could only brave the German storm, they would eventually win the war. On April the 9th, the storm broke again on the British Second Army in the Ypres salient. Again, the Germans overran the British battle zone, advancing in places up to 12 miles. But, as on the Somme, the British managed to stabilize the front by timely retreat and by mustering every available man to plug the breaches. Thwarted in the center and west of the front, the attack switched to French positions along the Chemin des Dames. By June the 3rd, the Germans had swept over the Chemin des Dames, driving 40 blistering miles towards the Marne. But there, the Germans received their first clear warning of things to come. The road to Paris was blocked, not by Frenchmen, but by Americans. Since assuming command of the Allied armies, Foch had maintained a strong strategic reserve. These reserves were now committed to holding the Germans at the furthest extent of their advance. Throughout July, the front held, and the threat to Paris was contained on the Marne. In August, the British, with the French attacking alongside them, opened the counterattack at Amiens. Never before had tanks been used to any effect. Since the battles on the Somme in 1916, where the first tanks had become hopelessly bogged down, their immense advantages had been squandered through tactical incompetence and a stubborn unwillingness to treat them as anything other than expensive white elephants. On the firm August ground at Amiens, the tanks advanced for the first time with close infantry support. For once, unannounced by the normally endless hammering of the guns, the squat iron mastodons rolled out of the dawn mists and over the barbed wire in the trenches, justifying every effort, every expense in their development. By the evening, the tanks were 7 miles beyond their start lines. 15,000 Germans had been taken prisoner, many more killed or wounded. But August the 8th, 1918, was more than just a victory for common sense and initiative. Ludendorff would call it the Black Day of the German armies, the day that Germany lost the war. Yet, if the implications of the defeat at Amiens were understood by the High Command, they were in no way clear to the long-suffering German infantry. On every field of battle, they still stood on foreign soil, and the front line in the west lay closer to Paris than at any time since 1914. But the continuing flood of American troops and arms ensured that Paris would remain forever beyond Germany's reach. And to the grand fleets of Britain and France had been added that of America, transforming the blockade into an ever-tightening ring of steel. After 4 years of blockade and monumental sacrifice, the Central Powers were perilously close to starvation and collapse. The capitulation of Bulgaria in September of 1918 only brought further isolation and further hardship. Rumors of defeat and the request for an armistice on October the 4th only served to fan the flames of discontent at home and further demoralize the armies in the field. In the face of burgeoning Allied military power on land, sea and air, Germany's allies wavered, then fell. The internal collapse of Austria-Hungary in October and her subsequent capitulation on November the 2nd left the ring of steel closing around Germany alone. In Germany, negotiations dragged on to a backdrop of political intrigue and civil unrest. Token but insubstantial gestures were made toward parliamentary democracy. Ludendorff was dismissed. A naval mutiny spilled onto the streets of Kiel on November the 3rd. By the evening of the following day, Kiel was in the hands of a sailors' Soviet. The revolt spread to Hamburg, Bremen, Wilhelmshaven, Cologne. The revolution that the Germans had conspired to inflict on Russia now threatened Germany herself. On November the 9th, strikes and demonstrations swept Berlin. The Reichstag announced the abdication of the Kaiser and the establishment of a German Republic. The Social Democrat leader, Friedrich Ebert, was appointed Chancellor. Panic, confusion, and the spectre of bloody revolution gripped Germany. Nothing now mattered but to get the troops home. Among them, there would be found men still loyal to the fatherland, still ready to serve it in its hour of greatest peril. On the 10th, without any further debate, Germany's leaders accepted the terms then offered by the Allies. And on the following day, the 11th of November 1918, the Great War came to an end. For Germany, there was little to celebrate. The armistice her representatives had signed fell little short of unconditional surrender. The immediate evacuation of France and Belgium would serve her own pressing needs to restore order at home. But she had also agreed to vacate extensive tracts of the Rhineland to foreign occupation and surrender immense amounts of war equipment, including much of her air force and fleet. Such concessions would not enhance the new republic in the eyes of those who would inherit it. 1919 found Germany still swept by hunger, chaos, and civil conflict. To ensure compliance with their eventual terms, the Allied powers maintained their naval blockade through the spring and summer of 1919, transforming the hardships of war into the famine of peace. Among the demobilizing troops, the infant republic had found the men who would expunge the spectre of revolution and restore order to the fatherland. They were the Free Corps, a volunteer militia of ex-soldiers. Their symbol was a good luck token from the years of war called a swastika. In Versailles, the victorious powers met to settle the terms of the peace. There was universal agreement that such a war must never be allowed to occur again, and that steps must be taken to secure a lasting peace in Europe. Germany was to be punished, her armed forces reduced to a level barely sufficient to maintain order in peacetime. Her colonies and parts of her national territory were to be parceled out amongst the victors. There was also the question of reparations, of recompense for damage to property. These things were important to the men of Versailles. For Germany, there was to be only blame, forfeiture, and humiliation. And for the young republic, a peace treaty that was to break its back, and by doing so, condemn the world to another war.